Welcome to the latest event in Imperial's SDG of the Month series. This month we're exploring SDG 6, Clean Water and Sanitation. This event is brought to you by Imperial's new Global Development Hub, which aims to provide a platform to showcase the college's impact on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. First up, we'll be hearing from the Chair of the Global Development Hub and Professor of Public Health Engineering at Imperial, Mike Templeton.
Countries. But this particular project, I think, is a nice example of the international and interdisciplinary kinds of partnerships that are going to be crucial to address SDG 6. So this is a project called WISER, which stood for Water Infrastructure for Schistosomiasis Endemic Regions, and it was funded through the Global Challenges Research Fund via EPSRC in the UK. Next slide, Tilda, thanks. So if you've not heard of schistosomiasis before, it's a tough one to say. Sometimes it's called bilharzia, but it's a disease that's been around for thousands of years, and it's a disease that's spread through water contact. And if you have the host snail in your freshwater, that is able to transmit the disease back and forth between humans and the snails and so forth. So it's a vicious cycle. Human infection is from skin contact with water that contains these infected snails. And these things, as you can see there on the bottom slide there, that emerge from the snails and infect humans are called cercari. And so it's a huge, it's a disease that you might not have heard of before, but there's about 200 million people infected or affected by the disease, and it kills about 200,000 people each year, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. It's got a lot of terrible symptoms, which are chronic and affect children throughout their lifetime. It affects things like anemia, malnutrition, and learning difficulties. So it has impacts throughout a person's life. There is luckily a drug now which is really effective at treating schistosomiasis, but it's not a vaccine. So in other words, if you're living in conditions with poor water and sanitation, you're going to be re-exposed and reinfected quite easily. And the World Health Organization really wants to move towards eliminating these kinds of diseases, not just sort of putting a patch on them by giving drugs and having temporary solutions. So basically, we need to find ways to reduce contact with infested water. And I think maybe what's a bit unique about this project is quite often when we talk about water and sanitation needs, we think about drinking water, but we don't think about other water needs that people have in low-income countries, like for washing clothes or bathing, or even for recreational water use. So in some cases, we might be able to just dig wells and access groundwater, which is safe from this disease. But quite often people live in areas where they rely on rivers and lakes, which are infested with these the larvae that cause this disease. So we need to think of engineering solutions for those communities, but we also need to think about behavior change, how to work with communities so that they appreciate the problem and also understand the risks and come up with solutions that best suit their needs. So WISER was a project which ran for 4 years. It actually just concluded recently. As I said, it was funded through the Global Challenges Research Fund, and it involved partners in the UK, but also in Ethiopia and Tanzania. And it was a really interdisciplinary team. So water engineers like myself, but we also had parasitologists and snail experts from the Natural History Museum, as well as people who were experts in synthetic biology at Imperial and anthropologists. And we even had a few actors actually who run a charity looking at theater-based behavior change around water and sanitation practices. So there's just a snapshot of the team, and Laura, who's going to be our next speaker, was part of the team at Imperial. And so we wanted to really, we had a few objectives. First of all, to determine how effective water treatment processes were against the parasite, but also looking at ways of developing really cheap in the field kind of ways of assessing the risk. So by taking water samples and being able to assess the contamination levels in the water. But we also had a big social science part of the project, also looking at working with case study communities to understand what would be some of the practical on-site challenges to implementing some of these solutions, and also get their input into what they thought were the best solutions for their communities. So ultimately, what we wanted to produce is science-based, practical, sustainable recommendations for safe water infrastructure in these regions. And And some of Laura's work through her PhD is actually we've presented with the World Health Organization. Is probably going to make it into some of their guidance, which goes out to in-country control programs and guides their strategies for controlling this disease. But the infrastructure in the WISER title also is not just about sort of hard infrastructure, engineering infrastructure, but also human infrastructure. So there was a big capacity building component to it, and also raising awareness and getting input and co-production from stakeholders as part of the project. So what really excited me about WISER, and what I encourage anyone on the call, if you're interested in getting involved in certain water-related research in low-income countries, is that, first of all, the idea of being able to eliminate this disease as a concept was really exciting to me. It's a disease that's been around thousands of years. And I think it is possible if you work in an interdisciplinary kind of holistic way. I think when you work in interdisciplinary teams, you gain a lot of benefits, and you actually come up with more creative and more effective solutions. It was great to work in Africa with leading institutions there and with early career researchers in the UK and Africa. And so that's always a big plus. And just the fact that it wasn't just a lab project, that, as I mentioned, I think it's really important in this kind of research that you work with people in the communities and with the relevant stakeholders in the country to shape and execute the research. So just some pictures of some of the field work. And if you're interested in learning more about the project, our snappy webpage is wiserschisto.com. So that was just an overview as a bit of a teaser before we get into the main event. So next, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Laura Braun. So Laura is the co-founder of CAPTA, which is a startup that's developing a low-cost automatic diagnostic tool for detecting helminth infections for precise and impactful treatment. She's currently a research fellow in the environmental health group at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and works on the MAPSAN project in Mozambique. And before that, she did her PhD and worked on this WISER project at Imperial College. So over to Laura.
Thanks for the introduction, Mike. Let me just share my screen. Oh. Great, can you all see that?
Yep.
Great, thanks. So it's really great to be part of this webinar today. As Mike said, I'm a researcher at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, but I did do my PhD at Imperial as part of the WISER project. And while I was a PhD student, I co-founded the startup CAPTA with my colleague Kai, who's a researcher in the Department of Bioengineering at Imperial. So in today's brief presentation, I just want to give you an overview of what we've been working on and also how this relates to SDG 6. One of the most common infections that affect humans are parasitic worms or intestinal worms. And this is a group of diseases that includes hookworm and ascaris, which some of you may have heard of. And these worms actually affect 1.5 billion people worldwide, primarily in very poor, marginalized communities. Now, if you are infected with worms, this will be marked by worms living in your body that feed on your blood. And this can lead to death, but it actually primarily disables people by causing things like anemia, diarrhea, and stunted development. And because of that, it's not just the health of people that's affected, but also the socioeconomics, because infection has actually been linked to lower school attendance, especially in children who suffer from anemia, as well as lower worker productivity in adults. Just to give you an idea of the level of infection, that image in the center there is a jar of roundworms that would be found in a child with a moderate infection. So that really gives you an idea of why the body is so disabled by these worms. These worms are very commonly found in areas without access to safe water and sanitation, and that's because the eggs that are released in our feces can very easily contaminate a new host in unsanitary conditions. And that's why adequate wash is so important, is because it contains and safely manages human feces. So I did say that these diseases kill and they disable, but actually a significant part of the health damage can be prevented with early diagnosis, and that is because medication exists. And in fact, this medication is actually primarily donated by pharmaceutical companies. So essentially we've got, millions, if not billions of people infected, millions of tablets donated every year. But the question is, who do we give these tablets to? And that's why we've got diagnostics to tell us who is infected and who needs the medication. But the problem with diagnosing parasitic worms is that many of the existing methods are very labor intensive. They often lack quality control, or they require expensive equipment such as microscopes that is often unavailable in low resource settings. As you can see in this image here, the worms are most commonly diagnosed by examining a sample of stool under the microscope. And a health worker will then identify the worm eggs and count them. So this, primarily depends on having qualified staff that know the morphology of the eggs. You need microscopes, electricity, which, as you can see in such settings might not be available. And quality control is really difficult because it's so easy to miss eggs or miscount them or even misidentify them. Now, you might think it's not a big problem if some eggs get miscounted or missed, but control programs have actually seen such huge variation in accuracy that it affects the prevalence estimates of a region. And these prevalence estimates get used to determine which communities get the medication. So you can now see that inaccuracies in diagnostics can actually affect where the medication gets distributed to, which has huge consequences. So we are, as a startup, solving, or hopefully solving this problem by developing a low-cost diagnostic tool that consists of a portable microscope, which is shown on the left there, that connects to a smart device. And we've coupled this with machine learning to automatically analyze stool slides. So how this works is you place a microscope on a slide, and then using image recognition, the samples are analyzed for a number of eggs and species. And this eliminates human error of misdiagnosing and miscounting eggs, which makes the diagnostic tool accurate. It's also very simple to use because you don't need to have experience of being able to identify the eggs. It also reduces the time of diagnosis because it essentially gives instant results. And it doesn't require electricity or running electricity and expensive microscopes. And so because of all of this, diagnosis is both cheaper and more accurate than the standard method that I showed you on the previous slide. So in theory, if this tool were to be used, in control programs, these programs could then diagnose more people for the same cost. And therefore, we would have more accurate prevalence data and hence more targeted drug distribution. In terms of progress, so far we've developed several prototypes of the microscope. And we're also in the process of building the database of egg images for the image recognition algorithm. And this has been a real challenge throughout lockdown because we haven't been able to travel to endemic communities and photograph these slides. But once we've developed the algorithm, we will refine the microscope. And the idea is to do this with input from local health workers, because that way we really tailor the tool to their needs. So far, our progress has been enabled by really generous innovation funding, but to continue the development and also to run the clinical trials that will be necessary, additional funding will be required. We were unfortunately directly affected by the ODA funding cuts, but we are in the process of securing more funding. So hopefully we'll be able to develop this in the next year or two. Now, I really do think that this kind of technology has the potential to bring us closer to eliminating not just parasitic worms, but also other diseases that you can diagnose with a microscope. And I think this kind of technology is really suitable because it especially has been designed with the end user in mind. It's tailored to low resource settings, and it also directly tackles the problem of existing diagnostics. a huge part of our development has been working with a really diverse team and consulting with stakeholders that includes, anyone from engineers, epidemiologists, biologists, people working in the field, working in labs, all the way to policy level, and in countries including the UK, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Mozambique. And I think this continued collaboration will really help us tailor the tool to the settings where the tool will be used, but also help us to successfully implement it. I think in the end, as is often the case with technologies like this, developing the tech is the really easy part, well, relatively easy part, but implementing it, getting people to use it, getting the ministries of health on board is the really challenging part. And because of that, we really want to make this a solution that from very early on involves not just the endemic communities, but also the many stakeholders that are involved in this. Thank you very much for listening. I've put up my contact details there if anybody wants to get in touch or hear want to hear more about it. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Laura. That was really great summary of what you're doing. And personally, a comment from me is just that it's really great to see this kind of work going on, because quite often when water and sanitation projects are implemented, it's quite hard to think about how you measure the impact of those kinds of interventions. And sometimes people just tick boxes and count the number of taps or toilets that have been installed. But ultimately, one of the main goals of water and sanitation is to improve health. And we need better tools to measure the health outcomes that come from the benefits of having water and sanitation. So I think it's an area where there's clear links between the public health side and the interventions on the ground on the engineering side, I think, also in terms of measuring the impacts. So there's a few questions that have been forwarded on to me. So one was, you sort of briefly touched on it, but where did you get the funding to develop the idea, and are there any competitors doing similar work?
Yeah, so when we started out, this was really just an idea that we came up with. And we saw a lot of advertisement for innovation competitions at Imperial, for example, the Venture Catalyst Challenge. So that was the first competition that we entered, and that was really, really successful. It was like an 8-week program where they teach you a lot about startups. And we ended up not winning, but I think we came second place. We won the social track. So that gave us a big boost in the funding. And then there were other competitions at Imperial, at other universities, as well as conferences that very often have very generous innovation fundings. So that's where we've gotten all our funding from so far. And was the other question about competitors?
Yeah, are there other people working on this?
Yeah, so just to give you an idea, when we started out, there were, I want to say maybe 2 or 3 people working on this, or research groups. And it was interesting that these were only research groups because they were only trying to develop this as a proof of concept. And when they did kind of develop initial image recognition algorithms, they kind of dropped it there. Whereas now, especially I think with the new WHO NTD roadmap, which is really called for more innovative diagnostics, there are a lot more groups working on this, probably closer to 20 now, including pharmaceutical companies that have now taken this idea up. So it's very likely that we won't be the ones that actually are the ones that end up developing a tool that gets used, but I think it's just really great to see that there are more people interested in this kind of work now.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question is, which country do you want to get started in first, and what, why is that? What's your thinking behind, where would be best to start? And also, you may have heard about the new UNDP accelerator labs, which have started up around the world. Is there any interest? Are you looking to hook up with them?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of country, when we started out, we partnered with an institution in Tanzania that I knew because of my PhD, and that's why we chose them. But essentially, you can do this work anywhere because so many countries are endemic with parasitic worms. So I think in terms of getting the images, we're now working in 3 countries, but we haven't decided yet where we would launch this product. I think it would very much depend on us making more contacts and seeing where the interest is greatest, and potentially also working with, potentially foundations like the Schisto Control Initiative Foundation, who are often the link between ministries of health. So if we could work through somebody like that, that would be really, really great. But yeah, we've yet to see which route we'll take.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. It's good to hear about sort of what your impact plan is to reach the intended end users. And then just a last quick question, is the idea that the technology ends up being a home toolkit, or is it still really mainly intended for medical professionals to use? That was another audience question.
Yeah, so we would generally say that this would be for medical use, because you do need to prepare the stool sample. And if people use it as a home kit, they would need to have, first of all, ways to then dispose of the stool and also to take the sample appropriately. So yeah, definitely initially, this is more for medical use, for health workers to have this tool. But I think just to say that often these clinics in endemic communities don't have microscopes at all. So if they could have a tool like this, they could potentially also use it to diagnose other diseases.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, thanks very much again, Laura. And we'll let you get on to your other meeting now. So thanks very much again for your presentation.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, so our next presenter today, I'm very delighted to welcome Dr. Charles Niwagaba from Makerere University in Uganda. So Charles is a really well-known sanitation expert globally, and he has 15 years experience in water supply, wastewater and excreta management, environmental impact assessment, ecological sanitation, and solid waste management work. He serves on a number of influential panels and associations in Uganda, but also globally. And one in particular I'd mention is that he's currently leading a working group on sanitation systems and technologies in what's called the Sustainable Sanitation Alliance, which is an organization that aims to deliver adequate information on sustainability criteria for different types of sanitation options. So delighted to have Charles here, and over to him to present.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to.
You're a little bit quiet, Charles. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to share the slides right away.
Okay.
Yes, please. Yes. Okay, so as I have been presented, I'm going to talk about the work that we do here, quite a lot of it, and basically in the context of addressing SDG 6, which is about water and sanitation. So my name is Charles Niwagaba, and I'm an associate professor of civil engineering at Makerere University in Kampala in Uganda. So first of all, here was an idea of try to bring into context our work and how it relates to the SDG, especially number 6, that we know about the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development, which commits the UN member states to take steps transformative in nature to shift the world into a sustainable and resilient path, to realize the human rights for all and then end poverty in all its forms, as well as ensure that no one is left behind. In the context of SDG 6, this is very critical. The issues, especially in connection with safely managed water services, safely managed sanitation services, as well as access to hand washing, are very critical, especially if we look at wanting to leave no one behind. Some statistics have been presented, which are looking at the global picture, and so I just try to reflect on what is happening here in Uganda. For us now to leave no one behind, it means that everyone in the world, women, men, children, LGBT, poor and vulnerable, must have access to water at their premises. They must have sanitation facilities at their homes, and those who are sharing with their neighbors are not included among those who are having access to safely managed sanitation. And as well as we need to have everyone also accessing hand washing facility together with soap and water. The current situation in Uganda, in terms of a recent report of July 2020, showed that we have only 57.11% of the, sorry, I was trying to admit somebody, I think, then I clicked somewhere else. Okay, we'll see. So the current urban coverage is 57.11% for safe water, And then there is no data for rural coverage in Uganda, still has got to be collected. And then the access to safely managed sanitation in rural areas is only 7%, and that in urban areas about 39%. If we are talking about a population exceeding 40 million people, then we really have a lot of work to do to make sure that we can achieve the SDG 6 in the context of everyone having access to safely managed water and safely managed sanitation. So now here, the main work that we do within my research group here at Makerere University, we do a lot of work on sanitation research. And in sanitation research, we look at the entire sanitation chain. You might be aware that in Uganda or most of the developing countries, the sanitation coverage in terms of those who are accessing flush toilets is very low. In the case of Kampala, a city of more than 2 million people, who increased by 2 times during the day as a result of those who come to do business around and go back to their areas, the access to sewer sanitation is only about 10%. So we are talking about 90% of over 2 million people accessing on-site sanitation facilities. Majority of these are actually pits, containment systems, and therefore when they fill at the household have got to be emptied so that they can be continuously used, and then the fecal sludge emptied must be taken to a treatment plant and treated. Now, in the work that we do, we try to use, to look at, even if it is research that we do, that basically ends up published in journals and therefore not read by local people and politicians, we try to translate some materials into what we call the excretor flow diagrams or the sheet flow diagrams using the World Bank tools, and then try to present these to stakeholders, let's say municipal mayors, city mayors. That is easy to show them in a diagrammatic presentation on how bad or good the situation is in terms of safely managed sanitation and unsafely managed sanitation. However, the SFDs themselves will present the situation in terms of how it is, or the proportion of sludge that, or of safely managed sanitation and unsafely managed sanitation, but does not go ahead to explain the underlying reasons for that lack of access to safely managed sanitation. So we take a step further to work with CSDS, City Service Delivery Assessment, to actually show how we can work with stakeholders to come up with solutions. We then use also some visualization tools. We have been working in a project together with the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences of how to apply serious gaming to enhance stakeholder engagement in planning for sanitation improvements. In the context of sanitation, we also, using SFDs, try to create a dislike of unsafe toilets. For example, toilets which are in place, they're unlined, they're in low-lying areas, they pollute groundwater, and try to work with the politicians to actually outlaw them in forms of, let's say, bylaws and other documents that can guide in planning for implementation. So our idea is to improve the SFD outlook by considering the entire chain, but also aware of the constraints of, for instance, enabling the environment, if it is supportive or not, in terms of converting lined pits, unlined pit latrines into lined ones, or outlawing them so that all newly constructed pits become lined. In this context, behavior change is critical, and it has to be supported by relevant laws or bylaws and standards. One of the other constraints is that the treatment plants often are few, they are not enough, and in some small towns and rural growth centers, as well as even big municipalities, do not have access to treatment plants nearby. Because of that, it becomes too expensive to transfer sludge over long distances, making it difficult to have treatment plants, but also resource recovery plants are not in place. So here is a typical example of an excretor flow diagram, which basically is easier to present to a mayor or some councillors that are not necessarily highly educated, or they are not necessarily technical, but you can show them that if you have a figure like this, where the green is representing safely managed sanitation and the red is unsafely managed sanitation, then we can easily show to a politician, a local stakeholder, how bad or good a sanitation situation in an area is. As I said, the SFD will show what the sanitation situation is like in terms of safely managed and unsafely managed sanitation, but it does not go ahead to explain the underlying reasons for that. So then together, we work with stakeholders to implement a system service delivery assessment, where we look at the regimes of sanitation service delivery in our context. As I said, in most of the towns in Uganda, you have side-by-side sewer sanitation and non-sewer sanitation, but the sewer sanitation is actually covering a very small population of the city residents. So then we look at in terms of enabling, delivering, and sustaining, and look at the 3 points under each of them, including inclusion for instance, enabling environment, funding, regulation, cost recovery, and so on. And then we come up using a traffic flow sign that where you have red, things are bad. Okay, where you have a yellow, things are not yet good, but there is some evidence of some sort of improvement. And then where you have green, the situation is generally good. So we use these simple tools to actually get stakeholders on board and work with them. Perhaps what I didn't mention at the beginning is that as a professor of civil engineering at Makerere University, our main roles include teaching and research, but they also include outreach, which includes consultant services. So some of this work we do also as members of staff of the university, but assisting some local authorities in undertaking research, or consultants using state-of-the-art tools which might not be at their disposal. Then, of course, we build capacity for them to also apply those tools. So there is another project that we have been working on since 2017, basically to try and look at sanitation planning using serious games. We developed a reclaim game, which basically is a game that can be used for sanitation planning by putting together technicians or engineers, scientists, to sit with politicians, farmers, urban planners, and people who are actually local stakeholders within the city, to visually present to them a simple way of which planning for sanitation, together with planning for buildings and other services, including treatment plants for fecal sludge and wastewater, need to be planned in tandem or together. In this way, we are able to realize that serious gaming engages stakeholders actively. It stimulates creativity and also increases knowledge about resource recovery, and it also enhances collaboration between the players. This is work that we have been doing, and we were affected somehow by the COVID-19 to implement some tasks that needed additional fine-tuning with stakeholders, which we expect to do when conditions will allow. One of the other key aspects of the work that we do with the stakeholders here locally is to try and pursue the issue of resource recovery. Our idea is to pursue resource recovery in a transparent manner and also to avoid hyping. Why I mention this is because quite often resource recovery from sanitation is normally presented in really only a good manner without really giving some information about some constraints that could affect its uptake. So in this way, we pursue some studies on pathogens. We use a quantitative microbial risk assessment to actually determine the risks that are possible, and therefore suggest or recommend some treatments that must be put in place to protect the users of resource recovery products from sanitation. We are pursuing studies on improving treatments, especially looking at the dewatering of fecal sludge. As I said, we have most of the people in our urban areas are using on-site sanitation facilities, pit latrine septic tanks. So in this, when we collect fecal sludge from them using vacuum trucks or even gulpers, we need actually to dewater, separate water from the solids. We try to look at simple ways and cheap ways of treating it using local conditioners but also mindful of reducing the footprint and treatment of the resulting effluent or supernatant. We widely communicate and disseminate the sanitation safety planning as a way of making sure that people remain safe even when they use recoverable resources from sanitation products. We also try to understand and communicate or to find ways of dealing with the constraints that affect the resource recovery from sanitation, especially trying to understand that the real economic value of fecal sludge is actually not as high as sometimes is hyped. It consists of obnoxious material. The fecal sludge smells, its form and appearance. It can't be used in a manner in which it is smelling, in which it is looking like. It has got to be improved. And all these improvements to put it in a form in which it can be used cost money. And therefore, the real value of the product becomes low, since you have to spend on making it look better. The social cultural realities also we try to understand these. For instance, we know that the use of animal excreta is actually widespread in Uganda, whereas that of human excreta is not necessarily widespread. And yet also the pathogens can always also be in human excreta, depending on how the animals are looked after, or the type of animals or the type of crop where the manure is to be applied. So we look at the issue of mindset or behavioral change as a very critical factor here. We use the runners model of behavior change, which was developed by a professor from Sandek, Hans Mosler. So we are working with him, and right now we're implementing a project to understand how we can apply a runners model into schistosomiasis research. So I'm happy that also the group of Mike Templeton is doing this kind of work. The idea is to try and really understand what kind of behavior we have to change. So then we have to have an idea about what people think. So runners actually stands for risks, attitudes, norms, ability, and self-regulation. So we have to first of all see what do people understand about schistosomiasis, and therefore what behaviors need to be changed. And then we use the runners approach to actually implement measures and do some measurements and see which one works and which one doesn't work and which improvements have got to be made. I think that's about it, and I am happy to have been part of this webinar, and I look forward to always being part of you, and also I will be happy for the discussions that will follow next. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles. That was really fascinating and really encouraging to see the different things you're doing to highlight the sanitation problem with stakeholders, and also thinking about some of the technical challenges associated with managing fecal waste in these kinds of communities. So we're going to hold the questions for Charles until the end of the session. So we're going to move to our next speaker now. So I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Robbie Parks as our next speaker. So Robbie is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Columbia University at the Earth Institute there in New York. But he completed his PhD at Imperial, and I believe still is an honorary research associate in the School of Public Health at Imperial. When he was at Imperial, he worked with the Grantham Institute to investigate the socioeconomic impact of water security in Cape Town, South Africa, and to develop water management strategy for there. And his primary research interest is in understanding the impact that climate and weather has on mortality, nutrition, and disease outcomes, and how these impacts might be different for different subgroups of a population. So over to you, Robbie, and thank you very much for speaking today.
Hi, thank you very much. I am about to share some slides, and so I'm just trying to share my screen, and I can't currently do that. So I was just wondering if, oh, okay.
You should be able
That's
to
been changed. Thank you so much. So I'm just about to share. Okay, so is that viewable?
Yeah, we can see
Okay.
that.
Okay, great, thanks. So thank you so much for asking me to present. I'm just going to briefly talk about the briefing paper so this talk will be largely based around the briefing paper, which came out a couple of years ago now, but in the aftermath of a Cape Town water crisis, which really sort of seemed to not only affect the residents of Cape Town very much, but also captured this sort of imagination of many people in the world at the time. And so it's highly relevant to SDG 6. So I'm just going to talk about a few insights in the time that I have. And I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the colleagues that I was also involved with here. So Megan, Ralph, and Marika really helped me to drive this forward while I was a PhD student. So as I said, this is a briefing paper released in 2019, and you can see there's a bit.ly link there, which has many more details that I have time to go through right now. So day 0, Cape Town. So just a few headlines. So Cape Town in South Africa experienced especially severe drought in 2017 to 2018 after several years of low rainfall. And so the city of Cape Town defined day 0 as when the freshwater reservoirs were below 13.5%. And this introduced additional measures to limit water demand and manage water supply. And as many would have seen in the press, you know, there were widespread economic and social impacts. And just as a brief background, Cape Town is rapidly urbanizing coastal city of over 4 million people, has a dry climate and relatively high per capita water consumption. You know, interestingly, in the Constitution of South Africa, there's the right to access sufficient water guaranteed in the Constitution. So part of it is an obligation that the government had to supply water. And so that became a sort of a legal issue there, really. Just one of the figures from the paper, just drinkable water consumption by use. Initially, the measures undertaken by the city of Cape Town focus on domestic use, which I've highlighted here, which is about 70%. And just one of the things to note really is that houses take up a huge bulk of the potable water consumption here, and informal settlements, relatively compared, are much less. And so there was also an issue of perceived water waste and wasting water, but you know, in reality, the houses took up many more percentage points than the informal settlements. And so, just briefly, why was there a water shortage in the city? Well, this is just a brief plot over time, which you can see that in the decades that preceded the Cape Town water crisis, the population grew from 1.6 million to over 4 million in 2018. And initially up to, you know, the early 90s, water treatment followed it in the same way. However, you know, in the 90s, there was a decoupling of the amount of water treated relative to the population growth. And so that was, you know, part of the reason why it was sort of set up to be a crisis when rainfall fell. And water shortage, as you can see here, is a particular dam that supplied Cape Town. And this was in January 2014. And in January 2018, you could see that the water level had fallen to almost critical levels here. And so that was another reason. And so, you know, there was already a huge issue with regards to the available water supply. And so the city of Cape Town undertook several measures, just highlight them here, to limit water demand, first of all. The writing's too small to see here, but it underwent a series of measures which changed over time. And so went from level 1 in 2005, way before the Cape Town water crisis, which was just in general to aim to promote good water management habits, all the way down to 6B, where they start, from level 5 onwards, they didn't just target domestic use, but also commercial use. And so it went all the way down to 6B, which is the maximum limit of 50 litres per person per day, and restricted hours of use for private boreholes. So because some private properties had access to their own groundwater supply. They instigated a series of tariffs. So on the x-axis here, you're seeing the level of usage. Now, interestingly, that the first few thousand litres historically have been free for users of water in Cape Town and South Africa in general. However, due to the emergency nature, after level 6, even the first few thousand litres were not free, and the more you used, it sort of rose in price in an exponential way, and so each colour is the level of restriction. And so by level 6, which is in the dark blue, using more than 60,000 litres, every litre above that was many more times more expensive, and so they were trying to encourage less water use for the heavy users there. There are also water management devices. Now, water management devices were actually installed originally in poor households to restrict water supply, but basically the idea is that after a set amount of water usage, they actually reduce to a trickle. So you learn to cut your water usage to the limit that is set by the water management devices, or the WMD. There was a citywide pressure reduction. So they actually reduced the amount of water that was used citywide by reducing the water pressure. There was also communication strategies. So there was a real feeling of everyone trying to be in it together, though that wasn't a perfect system. So I'll just take a few examples. No shower, take a sponge bath, use minimal water in a basin. For example, a navy shower, they call it, flush with grey water only. So people were using used water, not from the toilet, in the toilet there. So I guess water after a shower, reusing that in the toilet. And so another element was the Cape Town water map, which actually itemized water usage, which was incredibly effective for, I guess, comparing neighbors' usage. And they actually named and shamed the top 10 worst water streets in Cape Town. And so, and there were also smart water meters, but I see that the time is going on. So there were plans for managing the water supply as well as the water usage. Now, because it was an emergency, originally, for example, they had planned for desalination, but they quickly realized that wasn't reliable or cost effective. And so, from the original water resilience plan to the water outlet report, there was an evolution in the way that, for example, desalination was reduced in terms of what the water supply would be. And so I will just quickly move on from here, actually. What were the impacts? Well, inequality of access was one of the major highlights here. In some ways, every disaster and every emergency costs, sharp relief. The inequality, for example, we're seeing that unfortunately now with COVID-19, but in terms of the inequality of access to water, some rich properties have their own private boreholes, whereas other informal settlements were having to walk several miles to access their nearest water source during this crisis. Agriculture, around 20% lower yields for agriculture was estimated to have happened in the aftermath of Cape Town's water crisis because of the lack of water and irrigation. And estimates were, about $500 million US, with 30,000 jobs lost, and tourism was around 10% of the country's economy, and that took a sharp drop in the aftermath of the water crisis. And unfortunately, old prejudices were renewed, where a lot of the socioeconomic inequality was largely divided along racial lines, and so that sort of unfortunately brought up some old prejudices where, you know, the rich white community were accusing the informal settlements of wasting water, when in fact it was usually the other way around. So some good news. I mean, you know, since day zero, how Cape Town went from water crisis to overflowing dams in just 2 years. So it looks like, you know, the measures and, you know, heavy rainfall have thankfully staved off day zero for at least the meantime. But, you know, other parts of South Africa and in fact the world are still at risk and will become at greater risk as time goes on. And, you know, there are lots of lessons learned, which we put in the briefing paper, which perhaps have strong relevance for other industrial and urban centers in the world. So just to say thank you for inviting me to talk, and I hope that's been useful. And just again, the briefing paper link. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robbie. If you want to stop sharing your screen, that would be great. Great. Thanks very much. Yes, so I think we've lost Charles actually here. So I think in the last few minutes, we might just have a chat between the two of us, Robbie, about some of the questions that have come up in the chat. So one question in the chat was, what countries or regions were referenced in Cape Town's water limiting strategy? So I think the question was that Australia had a big drive in the 2000s. So did they follow lessons from previous countries facing similar situations?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I wouldn't be an expert necessarily on what the other countries had done subsequently or before, but you know, there was definitely lessons learned from other countries. You know, yeah. I don't have a specific answer to that, I'm afraid.
I was interested in the briefing paper that you guys produced too. I mean, can you tell us a bit more about that? I mean, how did you sort of disseminate that once it was produced?
Well, it was a Grantham Institute, so part of Imperial College was, you know, the actual institution which we dealt with, and once that was published, Grantham Institute were excellent in making sure that the paper itself got publicized and went throughout, you know, different channels, and it was publicized on the website. You know, I think there was some press coverage, and really it was, as I said in the talk, it was a group effort from the University of Cape Town. So the University of Cape Town, with my colleague Megan and Professor Erika Rivet, were also critical in making sure that the message got through to both the Cape Town authorities and other cities in South Africa and the world. So, you know, we wrote it as a kind of, because we sort of thought there wasn't necessarily at that point in time a sort of summary of what had happened and what lessons could have been learned, and so part of it was just trying to collect all the information in one go. But, you know, there have been other good efforts to do so also.
Okay, and then a question for me for you actually is really, are you optimistic that the SDG 6 can be met by 2030? You know, from an engineering perspective, sometimes people think, oh, it's just a matter of hooking people up to taps and making sure that the water flows to enough people. But as a sort of a climate scientist, I think, you know, the bigger threats to water security are probably on much longer timescales than meeting the SDGs by 2030. And you know, do you think some of the gains that we've achieved might recede at some point if people don't take these kinds of water management strategies into account, like the ones that you guys have developed?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, you know, the SDGs are, if we're talking about Cape Town, you know, there's certainly within reach. I mean, in terms of other places, there's lots of progress to be made. However, you know, we're talking about Cape Town specifically, you know, as I showed in the last slide, I mean, there are sort of 100% levels of dams recently. And that isn't just because of the rainfall, but also because of the change in behavior. So, you know, there's a certain memory in people's minds about the usage of water. And so, How long that memory will last, how that behavior change is a question that remains to be seen, and how quickly people sort of, as a collective, forget about crisis is probably an open question. But you know, if this paper could be of any use, it's really to understand that this kind of crisis is not a theoretical crisis. This can happen in many different places, in many different places in very wealthy countries, in fact. And so though SDG 6 is within reach, it actually is at risk in most places in the world without appropriate management.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think we've reached the end of our time. So thanks very much, Robbie, again, and thanks to all of our speakers today. I hope it was interesting. For those of you in the audience, if I'd encourage you to go to the Global Development Hub website, get in touch with us if there are ways you'd like to contribute to some of the aims of the hub. And just to note that our next SDG of the month will be on life below water and life on land at some point in June. So keep an eye out for that webinar if those SDGs are in your interest space. Okay, thanks very much to everyone for joining us. Have a good rest of your day.